Well, welcome back, or maybe welcome for the first time, to our series, In Case You Missed It. This is on the stories in the Bible you may have skipped as told by people in loud tropical shirts. That's the full title. I actually said to Bartley last week, I'm like, maybe we didn't think this through, because if somebody is checking out our church for the first time and they go on our YouTube page, all they're going to see is all these people in these crazy shirts. So maybe it's a good thing. Maybe that'll attract people in. So I'm not a very musical type of person, but I really enjoy music, and I'm really interested in the stories behind artists and bands. And so I was listening to a podcast a couple of weeks ago, and it was about the weirdest bands in alternative rock music. And there was a little segment about an artist called Captain Beefheart. Does anybody know Captain Beefheart at all? No? That's what I thought. He's a very unusual artist, and in 1969, he released this album called Trout Mask Replica. It never broke out into the mainstream, but it's still around. It was just so experimental that most people who listened to it they found it completely inaccessible or like just downright weird. Some say it's just outright unlistenable. Now, I know you want to hear it, so we're going to play a little bit. But don't say I didn't warn you. This is a little bit of that.
My smile is stuck. I cannot go back to your frown land. My spirit's made up of the ocean.
Okay, we get the point. Yeah, that's it. Whole album of that. But as bad as you may think that is, that album actually regularly appears on lists of the best albums of all time. And there's a lot of artists who say they influenced them, like the White Stripes, Sonic Youth, Tom Waits, PJ Harvey, all kinds of kind of modern rock artists. Okay, what does that have to do with anything? Well, this is a little bit of what our series is about. There are stories in the Bible that I think we view kind of this way. We skip over them. Maybe it's not that we actually miss them entirely. We just skip over them because they don't really make it into our mainstream reading because they're just too inaccessible, too challenging to our sensibilities, too difficult to understand and appreciate. And let's be honest, some of them just seem downright weird when we read them. But if you're willing to give them some time and attention, you might just uncover their significance. And so today we're going to look at one such story, and it's very short. It's only 3 verses. And so, in case you missed it, this is the one about the baldhead and the bears. And incidentally, the baldhead and the bears would make a fantastic band name if somebody's starting a band. A couple weeks ago, Pastor Bartley, he went into a story from 1 Kings last week. Pastor Barry brought us into 2 Kings, and we're going to go back there today. So I guess we don't read the books of Kings very often because this is showing up a lot in our series. But we're going to read from 2 Kings chapter 2, verses 23 to 25. Elisha went up from there to Bethel, and while he was going up on the way, some small boys came out of the city and jeered at him, saying, "Go up, you baldhead! Go up, you baldhead!" And he turned around, and when he saw them, he cursed them in the name of the Lord. And 2 she-bears came out of the woods and tore 42 of the boys. From there he went on to Mount Carmel, and from there he returned to Samaria. Like I said, an odd little story. But instead of saying, well, that was weird, and just moving on, let's actually rewind. And what I want to do is ask a few questions to help us kind of dig in and maybe understand what's going on and maybe appreciate this a little better and what it might mean for us. So let's just start with a very basic question number 1. Like, where are we in the Bible story here? We're in 2 Kings, which picks up the history of God's people. This is about halfway between the death of King David and the fall of the northern kingdom. So by this point, Israel had been split into 2 nations. There's the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. And at this point, neither of those kingdoms have been conquered or exiled, as we see later in the Bible. The Assyrian exile of Israel is about a century away from this point. But both kingdoms are drifting into idolatry and moral corruption. And so the monarchies, the kingships of these 2 places have been really bad up to this point. In Israel, all 8 kings that they've had were wicked. They were either permitting or promoting idol worship. And in Judah, they had 2 kings who were wicked and only 2 who remained faithful to God. So things are not good in either of these places. So what God is up to right now is his rescue strategy for his people, his chosen people that are now in these 2 divided kingdoms, is to send prophets. He's sending these spokespeople to call his people back to him and return them to him. And so at this point, by the time of 2 Kings chapter 2, where we're at, there have been around 9 named prophets and many other unnamed prophets that have served in this role. And one of those is Elijah, who was about to pass the mantle then to Elisha, who we just read about, and we'll talk about them more in a minute. As far as the physical setting, though, the story takes place in a city called Bethel. And in Hebrew, Bethel means house of God. And so that's actually what this was once upon a time. It was very much a house of God, but not anymore. It's located about 10 miles north of Jerusalem, and it has a lot of historical significance for Israel. If you go back very early in the Bible, in Genesis chapter 12, Abraham builds an altar here. Jacob is actually the one who gave the place its name Bethel after he had that famous dream about the ladder to heaven and God spoke to him. And then later during the period of Judges, Bethel served as a place where people actually come to consult God's will. But now, after the split of the two kingdoms, it's become this center of idolatry. It's very much not a place of God anymore. If you remember back to Pastor Bartley's sermon a couple weeks ago and the story he told, he talked about how King Jeroboam had actually set up a shrine with a golden calf to be worshipped, and that was here. People were worshiping that here, and that was his way of also preventing people from going on to Jerusalem. So they were doing all this, yet they kept the name Bethel, house of God. So it was this terrible mix of using God's name with this false idol worship that's going on at the same time. Okay, so we've got time and place kind of all sorted out. Let's go on now to the main characters. We've got Elisha was mentioned. So who is this guy Elisha, and why should we care? Well, I mentioned that God had been sending prophets, right, to return people to him, to rescue them from the influence of these corrupt kings and this idol worship. And one of those prophets, and probably the greatest, one of the greatest we hear about in the Bible, is Elijah. But before he finishes his ministry, he trains up his successor, who is Elisha. Now, going back to the original Elijah, he was more of a fiery kind of prophet. He was working hard to confront the idolatry, and he called people out, and he was working to restore an environment where people could worship the one true God again. And God eventually takes Elijah, and he directs him to take on an apprentice. And he leads him to this boy, Elisha, who he finds plowing a field. So Elijah anoints Elisha, takes him under his wing, and teaches him everything as they travel around together throughout God's kingdom here. So coincidentally, one of the last travels they take together is just before this story. Both of them go to Bethel before Elisha comes here. They go there together to meet with a few remaining prophets of God who are there among all this stuff going on. So eventually Elijah's ministry comes to an end, and it ends in pretty spectacular fashion. A chariot of fire drawn by horses of fire appears, separates Elijah from Elisha, and Elijah is carried away by a whirlwind to heaven. So that's actually a famous story, hopefully not one you missed, but another pretty weird one if you want to look it up. It's also how I hope to retire someday. Chariots of fire, whisked to heaven. So there you have it. Now Elisha is it. He's the guy. His mentor is whisked off to heaven, and the job is his. So he steps into this new role in a very dramatic sort of way. He starts by performing a couple of miracles. First, he parts the Jordan River, kind of reminiscent of Moses. He purifies this tainted spring that supplies all the water to the city of Jericho. And then right after that is where we find him. He leaves Jericho for Bethel, and that's where he encounters this group who starts making fun of his bald head. So, for all of our follically challenged brothers, let's ask question number 3. Why is a bald joke no laughing matter? What's so serious about this? Now, I have to feel bad. I have to confess that when I was younger, I gave my dad a hard time about his thinning hair a lot, and I feel bad about it now because genetics, right? But I distinctly remember a few years ago, I was getting a haircut, and the person cutting my hair, she's cutting away back there, and she goes, "Wow, you're really thinning back here." And I thought, wow, you could really use some barber sensitivity training. Like, I'm fully aware of my hereditary condition, thank you very much. And the amount of surprise with which you expressed that was beyond necessary or appropriate. So I like this story because it proves that God does not find bald jokes funny. But I'm just kidding. There's a lot more going on here than some mean-spirited teasing. That's what we're going to talk about. We don't really know much about Elisha's baldness. He may just be naturally bald. We don't know. It's possible that he shaved his head. Shaving the head or the beard was a sign of grieving or mourning in the ancient Near East. So with Elijah just having been lost, he may have been grieving that loss of his mentor. And so if that was the cause of his baldness, you can see how that already starts to take up the level of these insults as several degrees in their amount of meanness. But the thing that we do know is that the bald head comment, that probably wasn't really the main insult going on here. When we read this story, we probably noticed that first. It catches our attention, and we think that. But in case you missed it, there was another detail to the taunting. Did you notice? They said, "Go up, bald head, go up." What are they saying? Well, if you remember what just happened to Elijah, many scholars and commentators agree that this taunt was likely an attack on Elisha, telling him to follow Elijah. They're dismissing this new prophet, and they're telling him to get lost like his predecessor. Or, similarly, they might be sarcastically daring him to perform a similar kind of miracle, doubting that he could even really do it. Either way, this is entirely about something different than just making fun of his appearance. This is about rejecting his authority as God's newly appointed representative. It's about rejecting his role that he's come to serve in. They are on an all-out attack on Elisha. Still, even as hostile as these boys are, we are left to ask, did they really deserve what happened here? We have to ask question number 4, did God seriously wipe out a bunch of kids for making fun of somebody, right? Obviously, this part of the story goes beyond just being kind of weird. This is really unsettling, and that's sometimes why we like to skip over these stories in the Bible. We don't want to engage with something this awful and think that God would do something this dramatic. And while I'm usually in favor of, starting with a very plain reading of the text, I think this is an occasion where we have to dig in a little bit and look at the language and the words used. Most English translations that you'll read this story in your Bibles will say small boys, little children, or youths. And most of these phrases, when you pair them with this taunting behavior, it conjures up in our minds that we're talking about school children. That's what we think of, right? But the Hebrew words in this passage have kind of broader meanings. What we translate as small boys or little children are 2 words in Hebrew. They are ne'ar and katan. So ne'ar is a word that can include children, but its meaning extends further than that to include teens or even young men in their early 20s. So we see other examples of this in the Bible to know that this is true as well. A couple, just to name a couple, in Genesis 22, it's used to describe a young servant. And then in 1 Kings, it's used to describe a military aide. So these are obviously not young, small boys. But then there's the modifier word, which is katan. So that modifies that first word, and it means small, young, or insignificant. And the trick is this word is often relative. So it would be used to describe not just somebody young, but someone younger, comparison, to someone else. So it's not necessarily describing a small child. So where we kind of land on this, we don't know exactly, but most scholars agree that these boys were, at the very least, they were adolescents, but they could even be as old as 19 to 20 years of age. Okay, so that gives us a good start, but beyond just the close examination of this language, we have some other clues as to who these boys are and that tell us that there might be probably not just a group of bratty kids playing in the streets. Remember where we are. We're in Bethel, which had become completely involved in idol worship. And it was the home of this newest shrine to a golden calf. So it's entirely possible, again, we don't know, but it's possible that these youths or young men were involved in the idolatrous practices of Bethel. They may have even been acolytes or stewards of that shrine. That would explain very easily why they were confronting this new prophet of Yahweh. We're also told that there were 42 of them that were mauled. So this is obviously a very, very large group. This isn't, again, just a rabble of kids playing in the streets. This is a much bigger and likely organized group. They're described more like a hostile gang. So maybe they were gathered for this very purpose of meeting Elisha and confronting him. So our victims aren't likely the innocent victims that we thought they were. They have intentionally opposed God and stirred up his anger. So let's move on then with God's bodyguards. What's with the bears, right? That's the next question. This is pretty crazy. Like, I was like, are there bears there? But apparently there were likely Syrian brown bears that are native to that part of the world. There's a picture of, like, look at the size of these claws. I would not want to run into one of those guys. So why would God use these bears to stop this taunting and to exercise his judgment on these antagonists and what's going on in this city? Well, maybe he was just using what was available. Maybe there's a couple bears there. I don't know. Or maybe this was to emphasize the seriousness of the offense and to further validate Elisha as his, primary representative to the people of Israel at this time. We do see other times in the Bible where God does take judgment to these lengths of people losing their lives in very serious situations where they are opposing God's work on earth. So we get descriptions of people who are struck down dead. There are diseases and plagues. There's natural disasters. There's even a story of the earth opening up and swallowing up a group of people who were opposing God's people. But mauled by bears, this is a brand new one, and especially violent. And she-bears, and everybody knows you don't want to mess with a mama bear, so that's especially serious. So all I can gather from this is that God is sending a very clear and very pointed message that what's going on in Bethel is very, very wrong, and that Elisha is with God, and he is not to be trifled with. Elisha is holding a very special position. So, again, three short verses. We've picked apart the bits that we can, and I think we're getting a good understanding of the story. But there's one last question that's always great to ask when you're studying Scripture, and that's where we're going to land, and I want to take the rest of our time to talk through this piece. So the last question I have is, how could this event point us to Jesus? And I want to be careful not to force this question on top of a piece of Scripture in all cases, but yet it's amazing how often when you ask that question, you dig a little bit, you find there is a connection. And I think there's a very cool connection in this particular story and between this and Jesus. But first, we have to step back a bit and widen our view beyond just the scope of this particular story, because it's helpful to see there are actually a lot of parallels between Elisha and Jesus. So if we fast forward a few centuries, just before the birth of Jesus, we read the story of an angel who appears to a man named Zechariah and tells him that he and his wife Elizabeth are going to have a son, and they're to name him John. And of course, if you know the story, you know this is John the Baptist, Jesus' cousin, and the angel says he's going to prepare the way for Jesus, for the Messiah who's to come. Check out what the angel said. He said, "He will turn many of the children of Israel to the Lord their God, and he will go before him in the spirit and power of Elijah." It's talking about John. "To turn the hearts of the fathers to the children and the disobedient to the wisdom of the just, to make ready for the Lord a people prepared." So interesting, the angel is aligning John the Baptist with Elijah, and eventually Jesus himself confirms this. He would go on to say, he is the Elijah who is to come. Now, if you remember what we talked about earlier, Elijah was sent to urge Israel to repent of their sins of idolatry and to turn back to their God, Yahweh. And so if you keep reading through the Gospels, you'll see Mark makes very similar statements about John the Baptist. He says, John appeared baptizing in the wilderness and proclaiming a baptism of repentance for the forgiveness of sins. And so we've got this neat setup. Elijah and John, they've got these parallels, and it's setting us up for these similarities now between the next ones to come, Elisha and Jesus. So while Elijah was a very much more confrontational sort of style to his ministry, he went out and he rebuked rulers and kings. He created these dramatic acts of judgment. He made urgent calls to the people for repentance. And he even had you may know some of these stories, he had these showdowns against false prophets where they were matching miracle for miracle. He did all this kind of crazy stuff. Elisha's ministry after, when he came along, was a little different. Elisha, his ministry was more characterized by mercy and provision and restoration. He actively worked not only to demonstrate God's power through miracles and things of that nature, but also the compassion of God. And he did that by interacting with people and working miracles to help people. The Bible actually records 18 different encounters between Elisha and needy people. So is that starting to sound familiar? Right? Of course. It's It's what we read of Jesus. So check this out. Bruce Waltke, I found this summary he wrote between the similarities between Elisha and Jesus. So here's his kind of list. Both of them cleanse lepers, heal the sick, defy gravity, reverse death by raising sons and restoring them to their mothers. We're getting very specific. Helps widows in desperate circumstances, are kinsmen redeemers to save from slavery, feed the hungry, minister to the Gentiles, prepare and sit at table with sinners, lead captives, have a covetous disciple, and end their lives in a life-giving tomb from which people flee. So, and you've got all the references there. Obviously, we don't have time to go through that in detail, all those similarities, but it's cool to recognize just how many they are and how specific they get and the significance of all that. And so another way to kind of really summarize this really great is I found a journal article by a guy named Jerry Schultz on this whole topic of Jesus and Elisha. And he puts it this way. He said, Elisha serves not only as a prophet calling the people to covenant faithfulness, but as the Spirit-empowered man of God who walks with God, represents God, and demonstrates the way to covenant faithfulness. Elisha serves as more than an example of living before God under the old covenant. He also serves as a preview of what it will mean to walk with God in the new covenant, in Jesus Christ, which is ultimately how God's people will know him and what it means to live for him. So that's pretty cool. So with all that, kind of big background established, let's now come back to the story we're looking at this morning. Is there any connection to Jesus here in this story? Because it's not like we ever see Jesus do anything like sicking bears on people, so it doesn't seem very obvious. But there are some similarities. So think about this. One of Jesus' very early public acts in his ministry actually was an act of judgment. He drove the money changers out of the temple because they were corrupting the house of God. And here we have Elisha coming into his new ministry, arriving in Bethel, the house of God. So, little something there. But let's think about this even further. Elisha shows up in a time and place where people have completely turned away from true worship of the true God. And when he gets there, he finds he is not wanted and his message is not wanted. In a similar way, Jesus arrives and ministers to people who have also lost their way and drifted away from God and true worship of him. And he also finds he is not wanted. Elisha, when he does this, he's confronted and he's mocked. But because he is this Spirit-empowered man of God, the one who walks with God, the one who represents God, the one who demonstrates the way to a relationship with God, we know and see that he should be honored, he should be respected, he should be welcomed. And so to mock and to reject him is equivalent to mocking and rejecting God himself. That's what's happening. And so we find in the story, Elisha is under God's protection, and his dissenters are subject to God's judgment and wrath. So that's what we're seeing in the story. And the point I'm driving towards with that is, if all that is true of Elisha, how much more true should that be of Jesus? He is also Spirit empowered, but he not only walks with God, he is God. He not only demonstrates the way to faithfulness, he is the way. And of course, we know that Jesus was also mocked. When Elisha was mocked, we're reading in the story that it was such a great offense to God that it brought about this violent situation, this violent death came as punishment. And when Jesus was mocked, it also brought about violent death. But that's where the similarities end, because Jesus' story takes a very sharp turn in a very different and more dramatic direction. When Jesus was mocked, he didn't call down a curse like Elisha did. Instead, he said, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." When Jesus was mocked, the judgment and the death, it followed, it came, but it didn't come for his abusers. It came on Jesus himself. Because, of course, we all know that the mocking that we're talking about of Jesus took place at the cross. So I want to read just a couple of examples from Matthew's gospel where that took place. Matthew writes, "Then the soldiers of the governor took Jesus into the governor's headquarters, and they gathered the whole battalion before him. And they stripped him and put a scarlet robe on him, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand. And kneeling down before him, they mocked him, saying, "Hail, King of the Jews!" And they spit on him and took the reed and struck him on the head. And when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the robe and put his clothes on him and led him away to crucify him. Then a little while later, on the cross, we get this little episode. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself. If you are the Son of God, come down from the cross." So also the chief priests and the scribes and elders mocked him, saying, "He saved others. He can't even save himself. He's the King of Israel. Let him come down now from the cross. Then we will believe him. He trusts God. Let God deliver him now if he desires him. For he said, 'I am the Son of God.'" And the robbers who were crucified with him also reviled him in the same way. So again, similarities, but the end of Jesus' story is so much different. So what do we take from all this? I think this comparison we're making between Elisha's story and what happened there versus Jesus' story and what did not happen there shows in a very, very profound way how great the sacrifice of Jesus truly is. Because this little story of Elisha and his role as God's prophet, now Jesus as God himself on earth, it's showing that we know that because of who Jesus was, the role he served, his identity, he absolutely did not deserve what happened to him. And it was actually a massive injustice and an immense offense against God that he should be treated like that. So it would be very right for us to see the story of Jesus and expect an outcome exactly like Elisha's. Judgment brought down against his oppressors. But instead, when Jesus is rejected, when Jesus is hated, he takes that judgment that should come at those people and he takes it on himself. It rightly belonged to them for what they were doing to God and his representative. But instead, Jesus chose something very different. And that applies for us as sinners. We also, corrupt God's house in various ways. We also chase after our own idols in various ways. We all, dishonor him in certain ways by the way we resist or insult his authority here on earth and in our lives. But the other thing we can see then, because of all that, we can see how deep this forgiveness goes that Jesus offered. The precedent set by Elisha shows that Jesus had every right and the ability as the embodiment of a holy God on earth to call down a curse even worse than a couple of she-bears, right? But instead of cursing them, he asks the Father's forgiveness for them. Thinking about all this, it very quickly popped into my mind a line from a song that we've sung many times here at Renew, How Deep the Father's Love for Us. It says, "Behold the man upon a cross, my sin upon his shoulders. Ashamed, I hear my mocking voice call out among the scoffers." So that prompts me to ask, do we mock Jesus? Not that we make fun of Jesus. I know we don't crack jokes at his expense, but do we harbor attitudes or behave in ways that mock or offend the faith in Jesus that we profess or the authority that he holds? To put it more pointedly, are there things we would say or do that would hurt Jesus if he were standing here right now in the flesh? Of course, I know we all know he's alive and we believe he's present among us, but would our behavior change, would our words change if we had to physically look him in the eye? It's not a comfortable thing to think about, but we should engage with that stuff in a spirit of confession. So I want to just close by, let's remember and look back on a couple of ways we saw Jesus was mocked on the cross, and just consider, do we participate in some small way to that kind of behavior? Obviously for this would be very different, much less hostile in these ways, but, because we weren't part of an angry mob at the foot of the cross. But does the crucifixion story shine a light on ways that we in our lives insult Jesus? So firstly, we see that the soldiers mocked him with this false worship. They put the scarlet robe on him, a crown of thorns, and they sarcastically taunted, "Hail, King of the Jews." Again, I know that we're not that hostile towards Jesus, but do we offer false or insincere worship to him? When we walk in here on a Sunday, are our minds and hearts fully present? Do we really mean the things we sing? Are we distracted? At home or in our Renew groups, do we offer half-hearted prayers? Is our relationship with Jesus based purely on what he can do for us instead of simply who he is? Do we claim to follow him as Lord while still offering him nothing of ourselves and offering that to other things? The second thing we saw there was that the religious leaders and the people gathered there, they doubted his true identity and they rejected his authority as the Son of God. When he hung on the cross, they shouted, "Save yourself," very similar to the way those young men taunted Elisha to go up. So do we have that kind of doubt or cynicism towards Jesus? Are we pulling to press beyond that if we have it, and to trust him with our lives, to trust him with our families, with our time, with our money and our resources, with our future? Do we reject his authority in our lives? Do we persist in clinging to our own idols? Do we refuse to let go of patterns of sin or unhealthy habits? And I know that sometimes when we ask these kind of questions in this kind of setting or whatever, it can seem a little abstract when we're talking about sin and idols and offenses to God. It can all sound like very churchy language. And so I always find God's design for the family helps me understand this in a tangible way a little better, even if it's just a small way. And so every one of you is part of a family, so I hope you kind of get it and it resonates with you. You know, I'm thinking for us, we're in a weird phase now where our kids are getting older. They're 16, 13, 11. So it's like this whole new phase. And they're here listening, and I told them I was going to talk about this, so don't worry about them. I'm not like here to publicly shame them. We're just admitting like what we go through. At this age, they're forming their own identities. They're becoming more independent. They're figuring out their own interests and their skills and their desires and their hopes and the things they like to do. And so they're also making their own decisions, and they're forming their own habits. But at the same time, as their parents, my wife and I, we also see them and their unique identities, but we see them through our eyes. And we know the kinds of people we hope to raise them to be. And we want them to be safe, and we want them to be healthy, and we want them to grow in maturity. And through all this, we still have authority in their lives to help them do that. But that's where the friction comes into play, right? Because now, when we speak with that authority into their lives and their decisions, we sometimes receive in return a rolling of the eyes, or an exasperated exhale, or a grunt, or a groan, or a snappy reply like, "I know, and you don't have to keep telling me, and that's so boring, and you don't get it." Sometimes the things they say or that we say, are sometimes even met with replies like, "Dad, that's so embarrassing," or "That's so old," right? And what they don't see, and what my wife and I don't admit to in those moments, is sometimes those things really sting as a parent. We care deeply about them, and we've given up a lot to raise them, and every day we quietly make little sacrifices to work and provide for them and care for them. And so when you get these responses or these behaviors, it can feel like a mocking of the love we have for them. And so it's a bit of an analogy for God, and I want to be careful not to sort of mock God with this and minimize his holiness and authority in our lives, but just to say that this gives us even the slightest shadow of like an example of what that is like. Because the cool thing is, obviously this goes way beyond for God. He humbled himself to live in flesh and blood on earth. He died on a cross for us, and yet we still insult him in this way. But similar to the way that I still love my kids well above and beyond these moments of friction, God also does that too. He takes those insults, and he's still willing to love us and forgive us. His only ask, though, is that we recognize what we're doing. We recognize our sin, and we confess it to him. So today I thought what we could do to end is just take some time, just like a minute or two, together, quietly, to confess the ways that our mocking voices call out among the scoffers. So what we're going to do is, again, take like 1 or 2 minutes, just quietly to yourself. Take a minute, be with God in that minute. Offer up to him the ways that you offend him. Ask his forgiveness. Offer your hearts up to him in worship, and just experience that love and grace of Jesus.
Join us every Sunday at 10 a.m. at Cineplex Cinemas in Milton. Or visit us online at renewchurch.ca/connect.